Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. Dan, when you called me up and asked me if I still believed in free speech, and I said yes, I didn't know you'd then say, I want you to come and make one. And it was nice of you to use my high school graduation picture in the program. I appreciate that very much. I'm getting some years on me, but if I can just stay as young as you'll make me in these endeavors, it'll really help me a lot. And I always like being introduced for what's said, and I always like being introduced for what's not being said. For instance, Dan didn't mention any of the elections I've lost. And he didn't mention the fact that I'm the only person in the history of the universe to have lost his Senate seat in an election to a deceased opponent. Delighted to be with you. I think being a politician at a meeting like this is it's slightly awkward. My grandfather was born in Ireland. He was one of 14 children. There wasn't enough room in Ireland for all of them. Some of them had to come to the United States. But he said speaking at an event like this would be a little bit like being the corpse at an Irish wake. People come to look at you, but they don't expect you to say much. But I am delighted to be here, and I couldn't be more pleased than to support this noble endeavor. I think each of us in our lives seeks the understanding that we have meaning, that we have impact, that there's a responsibility for us, there's something for us to do that makes a difference. Too much in our culture leads us in the other direction. As a matter of fact, I think there's a great fault line that runs down through all of history. There are people who believe we're here by accident. There are people who believe that we were created and that we have purpose. And the voice that said, well, you're here by accident, said in the garden, go ahead and do it. Whatever you do, it won't make a difference. You're free. Well, when you don't make a difference, that doesn't describe freedom. That describes meaninglessness. The voice of God at the beginning of time and its echoes and clarity remain true today is be very careful what you do. You make a really big difference. All of us, I think, are born with this sense that we should make a difference. That's why the Bible, I think, tells us to choose. Choose you this day who you'll serve. Or you remember that verse in Deuteronomy. Now, if I don't get this right, Reverend Betzer, please don't rush up here and correct me. I only went to Sunday school, and I wasn't the best student. But somewhere it says, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. It's what we get a chance to do. We get a chance to choose. I really have tried to have meaning in most everything I did and have done. I've had the privilege of serving in political responsibilities and political offices. The most dramatic day of those, of course, was September the 11th, 2001. That Tuesday morning dawned clear as a bell. Sometimes we used to joke about days that clear when I was a boy. We would call them a severe clear. And we went out and got in an airplane. I was headed for Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The president was down here in Florida. We were all going to encourage students to read so they could make understandable and good choices in the political environment. That's one of the reasons we need literacy in a culture. And while we were in the airplane, the pilot turned back into the cabin where I was riding with a number of other individuals and said, call the command center. I learned about the tragedy, some of the tragic events of which were shown on the screen just a few minutes ago. It thundered out of the screen and hit me in the chest, and I'll never forget it. And we struggled the rest of that day to turn the plane around. I remember landing in Washington, one of the last planes to land in Washington that day. I remember them tossing the Kevlar-lined trench coat on my back, and I felt like David in the story of the Bible story where he was told to put on the armor. I sank a little bit under the weight of the coat. We didn't know what the outcome of the day would be, but it was a momentous time. And when the president came in the next day, we talked about it. He looked in my direction and he said, "Never let this happen again." I took that to heart. I might say that, just as an aside, if you're thinking about leadership, think about clarity. There's nothing quite as important as clarity in leadership. It wasn't do your best to see if you can arrange for this, not that. It was never. And that I thought was meaningful. And I worked hard at it. And I thank God that we weren't hit again. I thank lots of hardworking people, the people in our armed forces, the alert citizens, the individuals who protect us in law enforcement. But I also thank God for, except the Lord guards a city, the watchman watches in vain. It was one of those things that suggested to me that, my life could have meaning. We had meaningful work to do. We had a responsibility that was noble, the protection and safeguarding of freedom, the ability of people literally to choose as God has directed us to choose life as opposed to death, blessing instead of cursing. I think our culture is at such a crossroads. The world's cultures are at such a crossroads. We had a 9/11 as a sort of a substantial wake-up call in the United States. I don't know how long we remained awake, and we probably need to shake ourselves occasionally to remind ourselves that righteousness exalts a nation and sin is a reproach to any people. But we do need to understand that there is an opportunity for choice. And that's a substantial measure. That's what this evening is about, in my judgment. Our opportunity to choose and to make that choice available to people who haven't ever seen the menu. They've never been accorded the opportunity of understanding the story of how God in his greatness and goodness offers to mankind the opportunity for redemption, forgiveness, for healing, and for restoration. That's the one profound thought about God that overwhelms me. Another thought that relates to that is that God is so generous and so sharing that he expects us to participate in all of those events. It would be one thing if God were to look upon mankind as a failed enterprise that fouled things up, that sinned, that stumbled, that fell, and that he would do the rescue on his own. But it's marvelous in thinking about the great opportunity we have that God allows us to participate in the enterprise of redemption, of reconciliation, of restoration, of forgiveness, and of healing. A Bible story that charms me in that respect is the story of Simon the Cyrenian, who was this guy, ordinary human being, somebody like any one of us, who was standing next to the road when Jesus was carrying the cross to Calvary for the crucifixion. What a dramatic scene. The Savior of the universe shouldering a burden of a cross upon which he would be crucified. And history tells us that he slumped and stumbled beneath the load. And they pulled an average guy. They pulled they pulled a you out of the street and said, "Carry this cross for the Savior." I'm totally charmed by the idea that the eternal plan of the creator of the universe was not to just correct things after we had wrecked the thing. But he said, "No, I want you to be a part of the rescue after you've been a part of the wreck." And an ordinary human being picks up the cross. And the way I see it, the cross never would have reached a redemptive location had not an ordinary person carried it there 2,000 years ago. And it's strange in some respects to think that that's exactly what we're talking about today. The cross of Christ never confronts or challenges the cultures of the world unless ordinary people carry it there. And that's our privilege. That's our responsibility. We have the opportunity to do what Simon the Cyrenian. Have you ever thought that maybe it would have been great had you been there 2,000 years ago and had you been the person that had the privilege of carrying the cross for the Savior? Wow. And then maybe it would have also occurred to you that that privilege wasn't reserved to Simon the Cyrenian. That privilege is a privilege that's available to all of us, to each of us, that it's not just a privilege, it becomes a duty. It's part of what we refer to as this Great Commission. And maybe it's because I'm so simple. You know, when I was governor, they used to instruct people, make this so simple that even the governor can understand it. That's the way they used to understand, you know. But I like to break that word commission up, the Great Commission. I like to talk about it as the Great Co-Mission. It's a shared mission. What a marvelous thing. What nobility and dignity God gives to the created. The Creator gives to the created when he says, I'm going to share with you the opportunity to bring healing and restoration and redemption and forgiveness to the world. And we're going to let you be like Simon was to carry the cross for the Savior. The Great Co-Mission. Now, before David Letterman ridiculed me out of it, after I became Attorney General, long before that, I used to spend some time as a gospel singer. Some of you may know about that, and most of people who knew about that were afraid I'd sing tonight, probably wouldn't come. But I was once asked to sing a sort of set of services as a sort of concert in a place called Concord, North Carolina. They want you to say Concord. They are very sensitive about saying they were ever conquered. Concord, North Carolina. And they had 3 services on Sunday morning. I was supposed to sing a concert in each of the 3 services. Let me hasten to get this story out. I didn't think I could sing 3 whole services, so I had stationed one of my friends in the audience, Dick Foth. Some of you may know him, a wonderful Christian gentleman, but has a sense of mischief about him. And after I'd sung a couple songs, I said, I see my friend Dick Foth down in the audience. I'm going to ask Dick to come up and help me with a couple songs. This had been prearranged. This was as wired as a Chicago election. It was fixed. But instead of coming right up, Dick just squirmed in his seat and looked around as if to say, is he talking about me? And I said, Dick, I need help. Would you come help me on this next song? He got such a charge out of refusing on the first request, and the audience responded so generously to him that he still refused to come. I said, Dick, I really need help. And before he could do anything, a man at the far side of the auditorium, way over against the wall, jumped up out of his seat and says, I will! And came walking down the aisle. About 2/3 of his way down the aisle, I realized that this was an individual who was specifically challenged as a person. He was a person who had had Down syndrome. But as he came to the podium, I gave him a hug. And if you haven't gotten a hug from a person with Down syndrome, you ought to get one. They know something about loving other people. Of course, Dick came up and we sang a song. But something profound happened to me that morning. Because when that man said, I will, he said the 5 most important letters of the English language, I will. Those are the same words I believe that Jesus said when the Father asked, who will go? And his voice echoed down the corridors of heaven, and the Son stood up and said, I will. It's a co-mission. It's not just his responsibility, it's our responsibility. And my prayer on this evening and every day of my life is that when I'm offered the opportunity of participating in that great co-mission, that I'll have the courage to stand and say, and to walk forward bravely to participate if a person who's challenged mentally could say it.